Hello and welcome to Clearing the Lens with me, Melissa Sitole, a podcast to equip and help you in your ultimate calling, which is to glorify God. I'm a newlywed, a mom, a Bible-believing Christian, and a woman in corporate, and I'm so excited to be talking to you today. Today, we're talking about whether it is the government's responsibility to care for the poor and the needy. Please excuse my voice. I may get a bit out of breath every now and again, and I might sound a little bit husky. I'm still recovering from a cold, but for the most part, I am on the mend. So this is a topic where each of us will have a personal viewpoint on, and so I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on it, as always. And I don't just say that. I really would like to know your thoughts, guys. Please, reach out. Should the government be feeding the hungry? Should they be clothing the naked, supporting orphans and widows? Or has the church abdicated her responsibility in this area? Should government social grant programs be stopped tomorrow? What does practical application of our own God-given responsibility look like in this area? Today, I seek to answer these questions through a biblical lens. All right, stay tuned. Okay, I'm going to start off with a recap of episode 8, where we spoke about what the responsibilities of the government are. And that was after our conversation with Cindy Liverbuzz. I want to go into what the Bible has to say about the rule of law and what we should expect from our government. Romans 13 verse 4 says, "For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer." 1 Peter 2 verse 13 to 14 also says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good." In 1 Timothy 2 verse 1 to 2, we read, "First of all then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way." We saw in these verses that the government or those in authority exist to bring punishment to the wrongdoer, punish evil, praise good, and play a part in us leading a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go into the origins of taxes and how they were historically used by governments. A lot of the taxes we see and pay today have actually been around for millennia, such as sales tax, excise tax, property taxes. We first see taxes in ancient Egypt where up to 20% of grain harvests were collected as a tax by the pharaoh. The ancient Romans and Greeks also had taxes in place. Julius Caesar of ancient Rome was the first to implement a sales tax. Roman Emperor Augustus implemented a direct tax on people's wealth, which later changed to an income tax. And property taxes were levied in Egypt, Persia, and China based on plot yield of crops. Inheritance tax originated in the Roman Empire, and this was used to fund the pensions of veterans. So according to a publication on the Association of Municipal Assessors of New Jersey website, the earliest known tax records dated from approximately 6,000 years BC are in the form of clay tablets found in the ancient city-state of Lagash in modern-day Iraq. This taxation was kept to a minimum except during periods of conflict or hardship. Taxes levied in the medieval and early modern periods were generally levied to provide income for specific items of expenditure, such as military campaigns or to fund centralized governments, and usually so from what I see from sources online. Income tax was first imposed on personal wealth in Britain in 1798, and that was to pay for the wars with Napoleon. So now let's talk about the origins of the welfare states globally and in pre-apartheid South Africa. So we see this welfare state, or where the government is taking on a social responsibility to provide welfare to citizens, come into play in the 1600s with the enactment of the Elizabeth Poor Law of 1601 in England. However, I would think that this concept existed much earlier because, as I said before, we see in the Roman Empire that they're already using taxes to pay for the pensions of veterans. However, one can argue that we can maybe overlook this fact as the funding of veterans' pensions is still very much strongly linked to wars. In 1601, we see England under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I and experiencing a severe economic depression with large-scale unemployment, widespread famine. The rich were thriving while the poor were drowning. What's new there? In absolute poverty due to a surge in population growth from low death rates and high fertility rates, and England not being able to care for this growing community. So Queen Elizabeth proclaimed a set of laws, the English Poor Laws, to mitigate the general aspects of poverty and provide relief to those heavily affected by poverty. Up to this point, interestingly enough, the Catholic Church had taken on the role of providing welfare to those in need, due to the moral duty of Christians to follow the teachings of Christ, but also there was something called the sale of indulgences, which was a practice where the church acknowledged a donation or other charitable work with a piece of paper, an indulgence, that certified that your soul would enter heaven more quickly by reducing your time in purgatory. So the Protestant Reformation, which is essentially the breakaway from the Catholic Church, which happened in the early 1500s, meant people didn't receive divine favor and salvation from practicing moral deeds and charity, and so relief programs began to decline in response to this. Wow. So back to the Elizabeth Poor Laws. Originally, these distinguished between three types of poor people. There were the able-bodied, deserving poor. So those were people who would work but could not for various reasons, and they were given help or work for wages. There was the idle poor, who were those who could work but would not. This group became vagrants, people without homes who resorted to begging. The law stated they would be whipped through the streets until they learned not to beg. Wow. Some sources say they were committed to houses of correction or even fined. The impotent, the third group, were those who were elderly, ill, or too young to work, and this group was supervised in almshouses, which was housing provided by charities for people who could not provide for themselves, and hospitals, orphanages, and poorhouses. Going forward, we see the American colonies and state governments modeling their public assistance for the poor on these Elizabethan poor laws. The use of taxation to redistribute wealth and even out the inequalities of capitalism in the West became an ideological weapon in the Cold War, in fact. Now, bringing it closer to home, David Duncan's paper on the origins of the welfare state in pre-apartheid South Africa gives a detailed analysis of the history of welfare programs in our country. And it talks about how from the 1860s, we see the South African mining economy luring hundreds of thousands of African workers into migrancy, low wages, and harsh living conditions. And in 1920, a manufacturing sector begins to be established alongside the mining industry. We see from the 1930s more pressure being applied to the government for social welfare, and World War II brought greater contact to Britain and the US, where welfare programs were already well established, as we've previously discussed. And so in the 1930s and 1940s, we see South Africa begin to venture towards being a welfare state. When power changed over to the ANC in 1994, grants still didn't constitute a large part of our budget, and we really see growth in the people receiving grants in the period of 1999 to 2009, where the numbers went from 3 million to 13 million receiving grants. Today, we're sitting on 47% of our population receiving some form of social grant, according to the Daily Investor. And that's about 47% of, I think, 65 million people today. So really, we see the government mainly, along with NGOs, including churches, and some corporates, of course, bearing this responsibility today. So what does the Bible say about poverty and helping the poor and government's role in this area versus our role in this area? I'm not going to lie, this was such an interesting topic to research and quite challenging as well. And to be honest, a lot of sources I found outside the Bible were American, but I'm going to give this my best shot, taking into account our context and our country, and I'll share my opinion on what my answer is to this question. So the Bible shows us very clearly that God cares deeply for the poor. We see in the Old Testament Moses instructing the Israelites to give generously to them and to do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. And that's in Deuteronomy 15 verse 10. Proverbs 14 verse 31 says, whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Isaiah 1 verse 17 states, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. We see the cleaning laws in Leviticus 19 verse 9 to 10, where landowners were commanded to leave portions of their crops for the poor to gather. And so through this, we see God's concern for providing for those in need. Among the many sins of Sodom described in Genesis 19, her people were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. And that we see in Ezekiel 16 verse 49. Jesus says in the New Testament in Mark 24 verse 35 to 40 that, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. James 1 verse 27 says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. And I could go on and on and on. Truly, there are so many verses about how God cares for the poor, for the needy among us. Reading these verses, you do need to consider the audience, and the commands do seem to be very much directed at individuals and not at governments or those in authority. Regarding this, there is a verse in Jeremiah 22 verse 16 where the goodness of King Josiah is described, and it says, he defended the cause of the poor and needy, and so all went well. Is that not what it means to know me, declares the Lord? And so some sources do take this as an indication that ultimately the responsibility of giving social benefits rests with the state, because this was very much praising a King Josiah who was in a position of authority. However, overall, there does seem to be a very direct expectation on Christians and the church specifically to help the needy, which used to be the case. The early church had all things in common. They sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all, as anyone had need, the Bible says. But globally, as already discussed, we have seen this responsibility to care for the needy shift more and more to the government, with the church picking up a small percentage in relation to overall global needs of the poor and needy. In fact, Crosswalk.com notes that at present, the governments of the world account for nearly 95% of all the care to the aged, ill, and impoverished. Is this what God intended? As Christians, we are instructed to care for the poor. This would be part of God's revealed will, which we spoke about in the episode on being in and out of God's will. And so this is an instruction or command that the Lord has given us explicitly that we should obey, but can disobey and often do. I don't believe this radical shift of responsibility could have happened without a radical growth in indifference among us towards the poor. The Conversation.com notes the following, that believing that helping the poor is simply an individual or private responsibility ignores the scope and complexity of the world we live in. And I can agree with this to a certain extent. The current world we live in would not be able to not have the government providing social welfare or social grants, and definitely not in South Africa. What I am saying, however, is that the only reason the government has taken on this responsibility is because we have abdicated our own mandate in this area. Believing otherwise implies that we believe God would call us to something completely unattainable. And if so, then I think we need to evaluate what we actually believe about God and His Word. Some may say that we pay taxes and therefore that is our contribution. However, taxes are something we're forced to pay. It's compelled giving. It's not voluntary giving, guys. From what we see in the Bible, the giving required of us is very much something that must come from a place of obedience, yes, but joy, too, to be able to assist others. 2 Corinthians says, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. I don't know about you, but I'm definitely not cheerful when I see that tax deduction every month, regardless of where the money goes. Crosswalk.com again notes the following: biblical welfare meets needs and always looks towards restoring individuals to a position of productivity. It is interesting to see the contrasting objectives of biblical welfare and government welfare. The effects of sharing with others in need out of God's love are threefold. 1, a sense of fellowship and belonging. 2 Corinthians 9 verse 13. While through the proof of this ministry, they glorify God for the obedience of your confession to the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal sharing with them and all men. 2, a stronger family unit. 1 Timothy 5 verse 8 says, "But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." And 3, a high standard for work, which prohibits laziness. 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 9 to 10 says, "Not because we do not have authority, but to make ourselves an example of how you should follow us. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this: if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat." Unfortunately, and this is still crosswalk.com, the effects of social or government welfare are almost the opposite. It's because the motivation is not love, but pity, or even worse, guilt. When society tries to make up for previous wrongs by providing government welfare, the results will be permanent dependence and poverty. With the best of intentions, our welfare system traps people at the lowest economic level by indiscriminate giving. To qualify for support, most recipients must show only that they are not working, not that they cannot work. JourneyIntoTheWilderness.com notes that welfare programs are not designed to help transition someone from lower class to middle class economically, and certainly not upper class. The majority of those on welfare stay on welfare. Why? Because welfare provides just enough to keep its constituents loyally faithful for political gain. And so here we see a very different motivation and execution style between the biblical way and the government's way of meeting the needs of the poor and the needy in society. And I think this applies to us here in South Africa too, as much as these are American sources. Statista.com notes a steady rise in people living in extreme poverty in South Africa since 2016, going from 16.7 million to 18 million in 2022. Time.com notes that the social architecture formed over more than 3 centuries of white rule has maintained South Africa's position as the world's most unequal society, according to the Thomas Piketty-backed World Inequality Lab. There is no evidence that wealth inequality has decreased since the end of apartheid. The group said asset allocations before 1993 still continue to shape wealth inequality. And so there's definitely a responsibility on the government too to create a business environment that encourages investment and job creation, governance, more efficiency of state services. But government intervention in this area has done little to solve the inequality that we see in society today. Coming back to our own responsibility, one way to practically fulfill our mandate as the church is through tithes to our churches, which in turn would use those funds for effective and restorative outreach programs, and offerings which are over and above our tithe. There's giving to the poor and needy in our communities, which we know of, not neglecting our family. 1 Timothy 5 verse 8 says, "As I say and I say again, but if anyone doesn't provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." I am reminded of the African principle of Ubuntu, actually. Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, which means a person is a person through persons. And this principle embodies all those virtues that maintain harmony and the spirit of sharing among members of society. Do I think we could ever get to a point where the church reclaims this responsibility fully? While I don't believe it is too late for God to restore his bride in this area, I can't imagine that this is something that could happen overnight, because in a lot of instances, the model of how we do outreaches and how we help would have to change to be more discipleship focused and not an annual tick box exercise or being purely emergency driven and not everyday needs driven. There definitely needs to be a restorative element to our programs and mind frame to our programs in order for them to be effective from a biblical perspective. And so until that time where we are more accountable to this command and the government is more accountable to theirs, we will need government programs and we will need to pay more and more taxes to fund the increasing social burden which we as the church are not addressing ourselves. I have 2 points to end us off. I once read a book by an author called Tori Hayden, and the book was called One Child. She's an author, an educational psychologist, and a special education teacher. This particular story was a true story of a tormented 6-year-old who she had in her classroom and the journey of how Tori worked with her and helped her over the course of the school year. The Amazon review says the following about the book. 6-year-old Sheila never spoke. She never cried, and her eyes were filled with hate. Abandoned on a highway by her mother, unwanted by her alcoholic father, Sheila was placed in a class for emotionally disturbed children after she committed an atrocious act of violence against another child. Everyone said Sheila was lost forever. Everyone except her teacher, Tori Hayden. Tori fought to reach Sheila, to bring the abused child back from her secret nightmare, because beneath the rage, Tori saw in Sheila the spark of genius, and together they embarked on a wondrous journey, a journey gleaming with a child's joy at discovering a world filled with love, and a journey sustained by a young teacher's inspiring bravery and devotion. Guys, I cried when I read this book, and was so inspired by the story and the work Tori does, and how she brought healing to such a broken situation and such a fragile little heart. However, Tori wrote a follow-up book to One Child, where she met up with Sheila when she was older. While One Child had been something of a fairy tale and left the reader with a very happily ever after impression, this was actually not the case with Sheila. Sheila was still abused after she left Tori's classroom. In fact, life at home was still hell during that year. She just never said anything about it. And so there was a disconnect between the impact Tori and the reader believed Tori had had on Sheila's lived reality and what Sheila's reality actually was. In fact, in the end, Tori wrote the sequel book, The Tiger's Child, on a dare from Sheila, who had teasingly said, she never would. I mentioned this book to say that helping people, really helping people, not only takes a lot of work, but takes a lot of guidance from the Holy Spirit to show us the things we don't see, and maybe the things our pride might be blinding us from seeing. We may believe that how we're helping is truly changing someone's life, but we have barely scratched the surface. Even in our own giving, we need to be Spirit-led, or it just becomes us throwing money at people and not actually giving them what they need. Have we shared the gospel? Have we discipled? Have we cultivated a sense of belonging? Have we taught them? Giving, truly giving in the biblical sense, should never leave people where they are, but raise them out of where they are. And this takes a lot of effort on our part. And I know I am challenged so much by this right now as I speak. My second point that I want to end off with is for those listening who have children. I'm sure most of you have heard of the great falling away of Christians, largely millennials leaving the faith. One reason a parent gave on an interview as to why her child fell away was that her and her husband had created a Christian bubble in their home, whereby when the church left home, they were confronted for the first time with the gravity of suffering in the world. And so the child, raised in a Christian household that shielded them from this, believed that their faith was not adequate when faced with the realities of life. Parents, we need to take our children alongside us when we help in our communities. We need to have the difficult conversations with them on the horrors that exist in this world and help them evaluate the world around them through a biblical lens. Our children cannot be confronted with the reality of life when they leave our homes, or else they will never believe that the Bible is relevant to address this reality. Jesus said the poor will always be among us. This is not something we just wish away. This is something we address in a biblical way for the glory of God. And I believe the church has a much greater part to play in this today. That's all for today. Have a great week, friends. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you tune in next time. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and follow this podcast or leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. This is me saying goodbye and reminding you of your ultimate calling in this moment, this day, and this week, to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever.